All right, guys. So this is going to be the rarest of occasions because I'm actually going to commend Democrats for making the smart political choice because Kamala Harris has just officially selected Minnesota Governor Tim Walz to be her VP candidate for the 2024 election. So basically what looks like happened is over the last couple of days, after Biden dropping out and Kamala being sort of anointed as his replacement, we've had these tryouts going on. You had multiple different candidates that were considered. You had obviously Tim Walz. You also had Josh Shapiro, Mark Kelly, Andy Beshear, J.B. Pritzker, Gretchen Whitmer. And out of all of these candidates, I think, at least from a leftist perspective, Tim Walz was as good as it's going to get. Does that mean he's perfect? Does that mean I agree with him on everything? Of course not. Obviously not. But out of the potential options that were on the table, he was the best one. Okay? And then out of the last final ones, which it looked like it basically just got down to Tim Walz versus Josh Shapiro, he is much better than Josh Shapiro. So a little bit of reasons why I'm saying that. Here we have, as pointed out by Jeremy Slevin, some of the policies that Walz signed into law in Minnesota, keeping in mind that he had a one-seat majority, not a supermajority, a one-seat majority for Democrats in the state of Minnesota. They managed to get through universal school meals, breakfast and lunch, stronger labor protections, cannabis legalization, stronger LGBTQ plus protections, paid leave and paid sick leave, 100% clean energy by 2030. He protected abortion rights. He was one of the first governors in the country after the overturning of Roe v. Wade to do that. That's going to be a massive key factor in this election cycle for obvious reasons. $1 billion for housing investments. He passed common sense gun safety legislation and cut child poverty by 1/3. These are just some of the things that he was able to do with a one-seat majority. So that's where he's at on domestic policy. Now we move on to this. In terms of his possible political benefit for the Democratic ticket going into November. This is his political history and how well he has done, even in a place in his House district that was supposed to be a Trump district, right? So here is pointed out by Edinger Mentum. He says, absent a landslide sophomore performance in 2008, wherein the freshman congressman would ride a national Democratic wave to win by 30 points, Walz would spend the next 4 cycles fighting for his life and coming out on top. He survived the 2010 Republican landslide by a 5-point margin that very impressively still outran Obama's 2008 margin in the district. So he was outrunning Obama in 2008. He would win by 15 points in 2012, while Obama only won his district by just over 1 point. And he would come out of the 2014 red wave 2 years later unscathed, winning by 9. But his most impressive victory of all may have come in 2016 when he survived a gargantuan 17-point rightward shift in his district at the presidential level towards Trump and held onto his seat. Every single one of these performances were stellar, and they paint a picture of a politician who, at least for a time, had a very real appeal in a very working-class district that most other Democrats couldn't even come close to. So not only is he more appealing than some of the other candidates that were on the table to progressives for domestic policy reasons, but he also has a significant benefit in terms of potential overlap, right? Potential, appeal to independent voters or maybe even some right-wing voters, etc. Now we move on to this. In terms of why Kamala may have not picked Josh Shapiro, who I think was by far and away the favorite of much of the establishment, right? Here is pointed out by Jacqui Heinrich. She says 2 sources confirm on background that the deciding factor in the VP's choice was what Senator John Fetterman said publicly, which is concerns that Shapiro's own personal ambitions would cause him to upstage or override Kamala Harris. So as much as I think people would like to believe that Kamala made this choice because she's going to run some sort of like a massively, left-wing populist campaign and she's going to be the best president since FDR, whatever the case may be, I think the reality is much closer to this. I think that she didn't pick Josh Shapiro because she didn't want to be upstaged, because Josh Shapiro has massive ambitions. He wants to run for president one day. He's doing his best Obama impersonation, and she probably just didn't like that. She wanted to be the main person, and so having somebody like Tim Walz, who's sort of just like a minivan dad kind of energy, he's not going to upstage her in the same way that Josh Shapiro may have. So I think that's probably, the accurate interpretation of one of the main reasons that Kamala decided not to go with Josh Shapiro. And also shout out to Crystal Ball over at Breaking Points, because she made this prediction like a few days ago. She like pretty much directly word for word said that this would be a potential reason that Kamala would not go with Josh Shapiro. And it looks like she was 100% correct. Now we move on to this. A couple of quotes here that I think give an insight in terms of Tim Walz's thinking when it comes to politics. These are some of the best ones that I've seen floating around. Here from Jeff Stein, Tim Walz said, "The economy is a garden, not a jungle." He says the idea that you're somehow more fiscally responsible by not investing in education, healthcare, and transportation makes a nice political talking point, but it makes no sense. Not when we could have a better educated, healthier workforce that lives longer and contributes more to the economy. That's what a forward-leaning, vibrant Minnesotan economy looks like. Don't take the bait. Another one here, he said, "You don't win elections to bank political capital. You win elections to burn political capital and improve lives." And I think that that's 100% correct. Now, in terms of his, again, sort of like crossover appeal, I think one of his main benefits is that he's not going to piss off the progressive wing of the Democratic base as much as somebody like Josh Shapiro would have, but he also has, sort of like a weird, uncanny alliances between people that support him. So here we have AOC, who's excited and amped up about Tim Walz, and then we also have guys like Joe Manchin, who are amped up and excited about Tim Walz, apparently. We also have Nancy Pelosi, who was backing Tim Walz and trying to pressure in his favor. We also have people like Bernie Sanders, who were pressuring in his favor. We also have people like Sean Fain, the leadership of the UAW union, who was pressuring in favor of either Bashir or Tim Walz. So it's a pretty wide array of the Democratic coalition that was heavily leaning towards somebody like Tim Walz. And so now we get to this, right? So this is probably where we're going to get to some of the not so great stuff in terms of Tim Walz, specifically on Israel, right? We'll get to all of that. But just generally an overview here from Ada on his foreign policy record. We just covered his domestic policy record. Here's his foreign policy. In the House, Walz played a significant role in pushing back against a new war in Syria during both of the major pushes for U.S. involvement in 2013 and 2016. He was also a strong voice in defending Congress's war powers, so reining in the ability for presidents to just get us into endless wars overseas. So that's pretty good, right? She also says that Walz helped to lead a larger group of House Democrats to urge Obama to not go to war in Syria, which was critical to undermining pressure that was building on Obama to wage a war that he didn't want to fight. Now we skip down here again to a little bit more on this. Here from Barbara Lee and Ada. Say Walz pushing back against a new war in Syria in 2013. He said, "We have to challenge the administration," talking about Obama. "If we're being true to who we are, it is about the constitutional responsibility of the House, and it should not matter who is the occupant of the White House." She also says that after 12 years of war, the American public has every right to weigh in and expect that their views be represented in Congress. They also say that Walz co-sponsored all of the Yemen War Powers resolutions, and I believe those were brought forward by Ro Khanna and Mike Lee at the time, obviously trying to end U.S. support for the genocidal war in Yemen. And he even co-sponsored a bill opposing the U.S.-backed coup in Honduras. And then on Cuba, Walz opposed aspects of the Trump policy, calling it, quote, short-sighted and misguided. He focused on opening markets for agricultural trade to benefit both Minnesota farmers and the Cuban people. And then again, on the War Powers Resolution, he had this to say: "On the 16th anniversary of the 2001 AUMF, the authorization for the use of military force, we are reminded that it's Congress's duty to vote on war, and endless war is not sustainable." And then finally, he backed the Iran nuclear deal in 2015. So most of that is pretty good stuff, right? Now we get to this. So the Democratic majority for Israel has come out praising Walz as the VP pick and highlighted his pro-Israel votes and statements. So here's a little bit of what the Democratic majority for Israel had to say. They say, as a U.S. representative, then Congressman Walz traveled to Israel as part of a diplomatic trip to the Middle East, where he met with Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu. And in the House, Walz supported a number of resolutions that helped to strengthen the U.S.-Israel alliance, has fully and consistently backed U.S. military aid to Israel, and called Israel our truest and closest ally in the region, with a commitment to values of personal freedoms and liberties, surrounded by a pretty tough neighborhood. So, not good. Not good, to say the least. They say, as governor, He has been a steadfast supporter of the pro-Israel community in Minnesota. In the wake of Hamas's barbaric October 7th attacks, the governor ordered state flags to be flown at half-mast and condemned the horrific attacks on Israel by Hamas. Okay, that's not very offensive. And at a vigil for the victims, he asked everyone who did not immediately condemn the assault to reevaluate where you're at. They also say that Governor Walz has worked to increase Holocaust education in Minnesota and condemned pro-Hamas protests that excluded Jewish students from campus spaces. So this is a misinterpretation of what he actually said about the campus protests. My view, from what I've seen of the interviews and stuff that he's done on it, he was like generally, supportive or sort of like in the middle in terms of the campus protests that were happening against the genocide in Gaza. But he did say that in certain circumstances where people are blocking Jewish students from getting to classes, then he condemned that. I mean, a lot of this is editorializing by the Democratic majority for Israel, so I would just take that at face value. But, my read of this is that we were never going to get a VP pick. Democrats were never going to select a VP pick who's going to come out here and say free Palestine and criticize Netanyahu as a genocidal monster and, push forward with an actual legitimate plan for peace. We were never going to get that, right? We were probably never even going to get a VP who admits that Israel is an apartheid state. So we're talking about degrees of badness when it comes to Israel policy. That's basically just the entirety of the Democratic and Republican parties overwhelmingly, right? They are all extremely pro-Israel. They are all, in favor of sending weapons to Israel, et cetera, et cetera. Some of them are more rhetorically critical of Benjamin Netanyahu. Some of them say, okay, it's gone a little bit overboard in Gaza. There's a very few, handful of Democrats in the House, in the Senate, that are willing to say, okay, let's cut off weapons, right? So we were never going to get, out of the people who were on the table, somebody who is pro-Palestinian, somebody who is a legitimate critic of Israel and is willing to use leverage at their disposal in order to put them in line, right? That was just never going to happen. So again, we're talking about degrees of badness. And looking at stuff like this, some of the stuff I vehemently disagree with, but a lot of this is just like standard Democrat Israel policy. Like this is just what you would get from your average Democrat when it comes to Israel. We'll get to Josh Shapiro here just to show you guys that there is a big difference in terms of how they've been handling this as a subject. Now, here we had Tim Walz back talking about the uncommitted movement. Now, if you guys remember, during the Democratic primary, because there wasn't a real primary with, challengers that were going to be able to unseat Biden, part of the calculation in terms of getting people's voices heard on Biden's support for the genocide in Gaza was people voting uncommitted. Specifically in states like Michigan, this was a really big thing. And you had hundreds of thousands of people who were voting uncommitted just to send a message about Biden's support for Israel. And so Tim Walz was asked about this in a CNN interview. And let's go ahead and listen to a little bit of what he said here, just to get his perspective. Is he going to go balls to the wall and attack these people, or is he going to defend them? Let's see.
About 40,000 votes right now, 20% of the vote going to uncommitted. And we've seen that already in this primary in Michigan. What message are voters in your state trying to send to President Biden? And what do you want to see President Biden do in response?
Yeah, look, they're engaged. We're really proud of Minnesota. Civic responsibility. We have some of the highest voter turnouts. These are voters that are deeply concerned, as we all are. The situation in Gaza is intolerable. And I think trying to find a solution, a lasting two-state solution, certainly the president's move towards humanitarian aid and asking us to get to a ceasefire, that's what they're asking to be heard. And that's what they should be doing. We've gone through this before, and we know that now we make sure we got 8 months. We start bringing these folks back in. We listen to what they're saying. That's a healthy thing that's happening here. But I would note that the former president lost twice as many votes here in Minnesota to Nikki Haley. And I've seen some of these exit polls out of North Carolina and others. 80% of folks said they're not voting for him who voted for Nikki Haley.
So there you go. I mean, again, a pretty standard response. He's generally in support of people exercising their right to have their voices heard and says that what's happening in Gaza is intolerable. Again, he's a VP pick. It's not as if he's going to be directing Israel policy. If Kamala wins, that's going to be on Kamala for obvious reasons, right? But I don't think that any of this is unexpected from a Democratic governor, right? He's not, again, going out there and saying free Palestine and the genocide. He's going out there and basically just saying, well, people have a right to have their voices heard and, things in Gaza are intolerable. So I don't know. You guys read into that how you want to. Now we move on to Josh Shapiro, right? So to show you a little bit of the gap between how bad Tim Walz was when it came to his Israel record, and how bad Josh Shapiro has been on Israel. So here from Jacobin, Shapiro is quite simply a genocide apologist. He has compared anti-war protesters to, quote, people dressed up in KKK outfits or KKK regalia. He compared college students protesting genocide to the KKK. All right. He called for clamping down on anti-genocide voices, especially on college campuses. Free speech be damned. He supports a bill to punish colleges that boycott or divest from Israel, including financial punishments. He wants to remove funding from colleges that boycott a genocidal apartheid state. Okay, he continues. He also condemned Liz McGill, the then president of the University of Pennsylvania, after a McCarthyite congressional hearing designed to gin up dishonest accusations of tolerance for anti-Semitism, and before she resigned. As an attorney general, he went after Ben & Jerry's when the company decided to stop selling to Israeli settlements in the West Bank. So Ben & Jerry's said, we don't want to do business in these illegal Israeli settlements in the West Bank. And Josh Shapiro's response to that was, I'm going to try to legally go after you. I want it to be illegal for you to not sell your products in the illegal settlements in the West Bank. All right. They also say, a recent article in the Philadelphia Inquirer sheds light on Shapiro's past racist views on Palestinians, which he fleshed out in an article that he wrote back in college about the Oslo Accords that were happening in the 90s. In the piece, he makes it clear that he is opposed to Palestinian independence. His explanation smacks of imperial paternalism and anti-Palestinian racism. This is a quote. Palestinians will not coexist peacefully. They do not have the capabilities to establish their own homeland and make it successful even with the aid of Israel and the US. They are too battle-minded to be able to establish a peaceful homeland of their own. Now, some people have looked back on this and they've said, well, now he's in favor of a two-state solution. Okay, let me circle back to that. The excuse that, oh, well, this was when he was in college and he wrote this, blah, blah, blah. Guys, I'm 24 years old, okay? I'm not far removed from being the age at which he wrote this. In fact, I started my channel at about the same age that he wrote this. If I were to look back, and I had said that just a couple of short years ago, the idea that that should be excused, the idea that at 20 years old or whatever, that you're not capable of fleshing out political opinions on things like this, the idea that you would say an entire ethnicity of people, the entirety of the Palestinian people, are too battle-minded to exist peacefully, to have their own state, that's fucking insane. That's deranged. And by the way, again, circling back to the two-state solution thing, it's not as if like, okay, sure, maybe he wouldn't say this kind of a thing now, but it's not as if he's really changed his core policy. He is still an aggressive Zionist, right? He is still aggressively in support of Israel and what they are doing to Palestinians broadly. Do we think that he's changed his mind in the sense that he now understands the historic context of decades and decades of illegal occupation and ethnic cleansing and now a genocide or an apartheid regime? Do you think that he would admit that Israel is an apartheid? No, of course not. And so you can come out and say that you're in favor of a two-state solution, but if you can't even recognize the core underlying issues for why we cannot get to a two-state solution, namely the illegal occupation and the apartheid and the genocide and the ethnic cleansing, if you can't even admit that those things are happening, then you are not seriously in favor of a two-state solution. Guys, there are hundreds of thousands of illegal Israeli settlers on Palestinian land. How are you going to have a two-state solution when Israel continues as we speak to expand these illegal settlements and to fragment the Palestinian population into a million different enclaves? How are you going to work towards a two-state solution if you cannot grapple with that underlying reality of the oppression that Palestinians have faced for decade after decade after decade? So we'll finish off with this. Shapiro also proudly volunteered for the IDF during the first Intifada and boasted about it in that same college piece. Guys, he volunteered for the IDF. What is there to talk about? What is there to talk about? This is basically as bad as it gets when it comes to, you know, a Democrat on Israel policy. It's close to as bad as it gets. He may be critical of Benjamin Netanyahu right now, but let's be real about this, guys. he's worse than even most Democrats, I would say. So now we get to this, right? We covered Tim Walz, we covered Josh Shapiro. Now we get to the conservative freakouts, and then I'll end this video. Ashley Feinberg posts this from her inbox. Donald J. Trump, they're really losing it right now, guys. Donald Trump sent out an email with the headline, Tim Walz will unleash hell on earth. He will unleash hell on earth. Okay. He also says Tim Walz would be the worst VP in history. I don't know, man. I feel like the J.D. Vance pick is probably worse. In fact, I would say confidently, based on the numbers that we've seen so far, based on how he's been doing so far, J.D. Vance is the worst VP pick in the history of the country. Just by the numbers, he's worse. He's worse than Sarah Palin. He's worse. You could go back decades and decades. He is the worst. So a little bit of coping there from Donald Trump, I think. We also have Ben Shapiro chiming in here. He says, as somebody who wants Kamala to lose, picking Walz is wonderful. It's political malpractice. Why? Number one, not from a swing state. Number two, radical, underscoring her radicalism. Number three, she rejected Shapiro to please the pro-Hamas caucus. She's not competent, and this pick shows it. So, okay, a couple of different things here. First off, not from a swing state. If you actually go and look at the numbers historically throughout presidential elections, having a VP pick from a certain swing state, it may marginally help your odds in that state. But the numbers show it's really not that big of an influence. It's really not. Plus, if you had picked somebody like Shapiro, not Ben Shapiro, the other Shapiro, Josh, if you had picked him, you would also be adding on all of this baggage with dividing your base on Israel. And, maybe you'll get a slight bump in Pennsylvania, but would that cost you Michigan then? Right? So the idea that, okay, he's not from a swing state, I don't know. I actually think somebody like Tim Walz, because of his sort of like Midwestern dad vibes that he has going on, he could actually have a much more significant appeal across some of these states in the Midwest and even other states as well than somebody like Josh Shapiro would. So I completely disagree with number one. Number two, radical. Okay. Kamala Harris and Tim Walz are now radical, right? We just looked at the policies that Tim Walz has supported here. I mean, which one of these policies would Ben say are radical? All of them, I'm assuming, feeding school children, siding with workers, right? Legalizing weed, paid sick leave. Like, these are the things that are radical policies to Ben Shapiro. Okay, go ahead. Attack him on that. Let's lay out the landscape and you go and start attacking him for feeding school children. Good luck with that. Number three, she rejected Shapiro to please the pro-Hamas caucus. Guys, we just looked at a statement from the Democratic majority for Israel. Are they freaking out? Are they crying about how Tim Walz is anti-Semitic and pro-Hamas or whatever the case may be? No, he has a standard Democrat position when it comes to Israel. Now, of course, Ben Shapiro even thinks somebody like Joe Biden, who has been fully complicit in this genocide for 9-10 months straight at this point, proudly calls himself a Zionist. Ben Shapiro would look at somebody like Joe Biden and say he's pro-Hamas, right? He's anti-Israel because he criticized the amount of, dead Palestinian babies that Israel has allowed or has caused inside of Gaza. Like, this guy thinks anybody to the left of Donald Trump when it comes to Israel policy is pro-Hamas. So not exactly a valuable insight there coming from somebody like Shapiro, but that's kind of the take. And this has been a through line, right? Which is amazing because, again, Tim Walz is not a free Palestine guy. Tim Walz is not going to confront the state of Israel. Like, what do you think is going to happen? That's not on the table, Ben. But this is one of the attacks that they're going with, right? Another one here from Josh Hammer. Kamala's pick is Tim Walz. She passed on Josh Shapiro out of fear of the Democratic Party's Hamas-Hezbollah wing. I guess that's where I'm at. I'm in the Hamas-Hezbollah wing, according to this guy. Democrat elites are terrified of the keffiyeh-clad radicals in Dearborn. Jesus Christ. That says everything you need to know about Kamala and the modern Democratic Party. So they're basically saying she didn't pick Josh Shapiro because she was scared of the Hamas-Hezbollah wing, right? Other people have been saying that she didn't pick Josh Shapiro because her base is anti-Semitic and Kamala is anti-Semitic, etc., etc. It's all just ludicrous, guys. It's all just ludicrous. We're talking about an ongoing genocide. Like, can we just pause on that for a second? Like, in any reasonable world, this would be something that wouldn't even be on the table for discussion, let alone for this to be used as an attack point to say, you are not pro-genocide enough. So therefore, you are pro-Hamas, pro-Hezbollah, anti-Semitic, whatever the fuck. In a reasonable country, this would not even be a conversation, guys. The rest of the world does not view this through the same lens that Americans broadly view this issue. And by the way, a majority of Americans have supported a ceasefire for a long time, for months, right? So it's not as if like the majority of the American people are saying, let's give Bibi whatever the fuck he wants and allow him to spiral us towards World War III. That's not the position of the American people, actually, right? But this is sort of their distorted view of Israel policy in the U.S. Now, we also have this. Walz, as I pointed out earlier, was a vocal supporter of the nuclear deal with Iran. So that's based, I mean, again, obviously Israel right now, it seems like it's hell-bent on trying to drag us into a war with Iran. But Iran just elected a new president who seemed like he ran on a platform that was more amenable towards potentially repairing the U.S.-Iran relationship. So putting aside the fact that Israel's trying to throw a wrench in that, you know, having a VP in there like Tim Walz, who was pro-Iran nuclear deal, you know, that's something to take into consideration, I guess, as well. Another attack here from Mike Solana. He says, she really said, I don't know, Shapiro's Jewish, though. Let's just go with the pro-crime communist. Tim Walz, the pro-crime communist. Huh? Where did the communism come into Tim Walz's platform, guys? I'm saying this as a socialist myself. I don't think that Tim Walz is a communist, actually. I think he's just like sort of a standard, you know, center-left, more lefty liberal who, you know, has passed some social democratic policies in his state that have been wildly successful. Wouldn't call him a socialist, though, right? But I guess this is the attack they're going with, guys. He's a pro-crime communist, communist. We also had this here. Tim Walz is a literal, in italics here, a literal supporter of socialism who oversaw the Minnesota riots and carries no must-win state. You don't pick him because it's the best choice. You pick him because, again, your base would have rebelled if you picked the Josh Shapiro Jewish alternative. So they're really trying to make this into an anti-Semite thing, which is also pretty bizarre. This is the last thing I pulled up. You have the Trump War Room tweeting out, just no caption, just a picture of Tim Walz with Ilhan Omar. All right. Okay. Is this just straight, you know, anti-Islam bigotry that's going on here? What is this? What is this picture supposed to say? Anyways, the point that I was going to say is that it's pretty ironic how many people are saying that progressives didn't like Josh Shapiro, not for policy reasons when it comes to Israel, but they didn't like him just because he's Jewish, right? I'm sorry. Who the fuck has been the main guy for progressives in this country for the last like 10 years? It's been Bernie Sanders, guys. Bernie Sanders has been the main guy for the left-wing base of the Democratic Party for a decade straight. He's a Jewish man. The idea that like the left is deeply anti-Semitic and they're just targeting people for their religion or their ethnicity, it's ridiculous. That was our main guy, Bernie Sanders. We tried to get him elected twice in a row, 2016, 2020. It was the establishment that actually sabotaged him both times back to back. So would you then say that the establishment of the Democratic Party is anti-Semitic? I don't know. They call everybody anti-Semitic, who, again, does not want to fully back Israel's genocide in Gaza. So there you go, guys. Tim Walz, the selection. I honestly was not expecting this because in my brain, it's pretty much like whatever is the worst possible thing that could happen, that's what's most likely to happen. But they actually did it. They dodged the Josh Shapiro bullet. They picked Tim Walz, and tell me what you guys think about it.
Politic guy has the best politics. Believe me, no one does it like him. Believe me, everyone is saying